today I'm going to expose myself, but in the nicest possible way. But I have to reflect a little bit on life at first, and I think back to when I was a young teenager, working in the shearing sheds of Cumnock in the central west of New South Wales. And here I am today with the Dalai Lama before me, ruby wax before me. I'm thinking, how far has my life come? Today I'm going to try and condense those 57 years into 18 minutes and tell you a little bit about my story. I joined the police force at 19 years of age, left those shearing sheds and went to Darlinghurst and King's Cross. It was a rather large cultural shift in my life, I can assure you. Through my police career, I met some absolutely wonderful people, met some quite horrible people, but I met a very, very special person, a very, very special lady who was also a detective. And in 1988, I happened to meet her socially. In 1984, I had met her professionally. She was one of my students at the detectives training course. In that same course was a young detective called Peter Addison. Those two people would have a big impact on my life in years to come. So in 1988, I met Deb. We met up socially, as I said, and then we decided that we might sort of form a little bit of a relationship. That was all going swimmingly well, and in 1993, I proposed to Deb, and I said, why don't we go and get married? And she said, fantastic idea, darling. I said, let's go to Paris. She said, great. I said, let's take some time off. Deb was working at the child protection team. She was investigating the sexual and physical abuse of children, so she had a very, very traumatic job. I said, let's take some time out from what we're doing. I was playing representative rugby. Deb was playing representative basketball. I was part of the Special Weapons Operations team at Coffs Harbour. Life was going really, really great. So she said, how are we going to get around Europe, Al? And I said, well, we can't really afford to buy a car. I'm not mechanical. We can't lease a car. And one of our friends said, why don't you buy bikes and ride around Europe? Deb thought this is a rather insane idea. But as it turns out, that's what we did. And for 5 months, we rode those push bikes with our tent and our cooking equipment and our sleeping bags, 5 months around Europe. And we rode 6,000 kilometres. That trip was not only a great experience, but it also taught me just how amazing this woman was and how much she was going to show her strength later on for me. We came back from our honeymoon. We then proceeded to have a honeymoon, and 9 months later our firstborn arrived, Nicola Paris Sparkes. So we had this wonderful experience of this trip around Europe on our bikes. We had our newborn, who was soon to be one. And then life started to change. I was called into work one evening, just before our Nicky's first birthday, and the station sergeant said, Al, 2 of the boys have been shot at Crescent Head. Crescent Head was 2 hours south of Coffs Harbour. And 2 policemen, Bob Spears and Peter Addison, had been called to a domestic situation. A chap had graffitied his ex-girlfriend's car and threatened to kill her. Bob and Pete turned up in the paddy wagon, anticipating to speak to him, possibly arrest him. He was there waiting with them, for them, I beg your pardon, with a high-powered rifle, and he opened fire on them. Bob Spears was shot in the head and dropped to the ground. Pete engaged fire, tried to get help for his mate. Radios didn't work. He kicked the door in of a house next door, screamed for a telephone. There was no telephone. Pete went outside. Again, my belief is to try and get help for his mate. He was reloading his revolver, and the gunman came over and shot him dead. So my job as part of the support team was to get to Crescent Head as quickly as possible. We had to then rescue some other people who the commanders thought the gunman was going to murder next. Then eventually assault the gunman's home and recover Pete and Bob's bodies. That was the first time that my psychological health took a massive sledgehammer hit. I started to have feelings and symptoms that I had never ever experienced before. I started to feel very vulnerable, I started to feel very frightened, and I started to develop symptoms of what I now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. But I was going okay, or so I thought, and I kept pushing and trying harder and harder. Just a few months after that, I was involved in the rescue of a small child had been swept 600 metres down a stormwater pipe, no greater in diameter than a hula hoop. When we got to this site where this young lad had been swept down, I was attached to a rope and washed down this pipe to try and recover what we thought was his body. What it then turned out to be was at least some debris trapped in the pipe. So I was hauled back out of that pipe. They then said that there's a child could be heard screaming down at the Pacific Highway, 600 metres away. We couldn't believe that this child had been washed so far. So we raced down to the Pacific Highway, and as we jumped out of the car, we could hear these screams of this child. And I raced over this manhole, and there's water bubbling up through the manhole. And these screams are coming up through this manhole. So my workmate, Gavin, and I, we had to get down into there. So Gavin went down before me, and then I followed him down after. And we came upon these 6 storm water pipes were flowing on top of us. And the water was roaring, the screams of this child were going round and round and round, and we just didn't know where he was. But eventually I crawled up this pipe and found this young kid, and we got him out. That, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as my psychological health was concerned. And from that moment on, I started to live my life back down that drain. It was full of darkness, full of terror, and I felt as though I was crawling against the flow of the water, trying to hang on dearly for life. I was recognised for my bravery, and I was very proud of the award I received. And publicly I was being hailed as this hero, but personally I was just falling apart. I started to develop these feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness, of shame and guilt. Stupidly, I didn't disclose to my wife these feelings I was having. And stupidly, I turned to alcohol to try and medicate myself. And I let myself fall apart physically. And I just entered this downward spiral. In October 1996, I went to work after kissing my wife goodbye, my little daughter goodbye, pulled my gun out with the intention of killing myself. Fortunately, a workmate walked in, intervened, and then they took me home. That night I was before a crisis counsellor, and she said to Deb, who was with me, Deb, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to schedule Al, which means take me and lock me up in a psychiatric unit. Deb said, no, you're not taking Al, he's staying with me. And that was the first time I had any hope. I have never felt in such a low point in my whole life. The next morning I was taken to the Jordan Clinic, which was a local mental health unit. And there I was sort of sitting there contemplating life, contemplating death, and realising where my life had come from. And I had literally gone from the penthouse to the outhouse. And I used to see the psychiatrist 3 days a week. When I first started going to the psychiatric unit, I'd sit in the waiting room, and in the waiting room was also the methadone clinic. So all the local heroin addicts used to sit there. And at first I think they thought I was doing covert surveillance on them. But of course I wasn't. I was there to seek treatment. So I became the brunt of their jokes and their smears. So it wasn't a very pleasant place to be, I can assure you. But I knew I had to be there, I knew I had to stay there, and I knew I had to try to get better. Whilst I used to sit in that waiting room trying to avoid the comments of the local drug addicts, I used to take myself to this very special place. And I used to imagine I was out on a yacht sailing across an ocean. And that was my go-to place. And I would sit there and I would just literally meditate and transform myself to being out on that ocean. And that vision turned into a goal for me that one day I was going to be there. I desperately tried to go back to work as a policeman because that was my first love. But sadly the police force deemed that my psychiatric state was unsuitable for duties and I was discharged against my wishes. So at 38 years of age, I had no job, a wife to support, a child to support, and no real future. But I had to make a decision to change, and I had to make a decision to overcome this adversity that was facing me. But deep in the recesses of my mind was this idea that I was going to have this boat and sail across the ocean. In 2008, I drove my wife insane with the idea about getting this boat. She said, that's great, Al, but what about my chronic seasickness I suffer from? Not really my problem, darling. I've got to get that boat. So I found this boat, and I found it on the internet. And I said, Debsy, I found it. She said, oh, great, where is it? I said, London. She said, well, how are you going to find this boat over there? I said, well, I want to fly there. She said, well, we can't afford for you just to fly over there and at a whim to see this boat. I said, I know, but I've got to see it. So I pestered her and pestered her. And one morning about 2 o'clock, I tapped her on the shoulder and she said, oh, God, not now. I said, no, it's about this boat. She said, oh, what about the sex? I said, no, the boat. She said, I'll make you a deal, Al. I'll get on the phone, I'll ring Qantas frequent flyers. And if you can get flights there, go and see this boat. 2 hours later, she had tickets for me to London and return. I had 7 days to go and view this boat. In March 2009, just some months later, Deb, my 2 children who were 9 and 14, and myself flew on one-way tickets back to London and boarded our boat Sunboy. She was the boat of my dreams. We had no idea about what we were going to do, just this idea that we were going to suck the guts out of life. Deb knew deep down how much this boat meant to be and what this boat could mean to our family. Another young lad from Coffs Harbour joined us in the Canary Islands. We had decided that we were going to bring this boat back to Australia. But we knew we had thousands of miles to cross the Atlantic Ocean, through the Panama Canal and thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean. But we took it upon ourselves to analyse these risks about what we're going to do, and we weighed up the rewards of what it might give us, for me personally, and for us as a family, and also for my wife and my children individually. We realised there was many benefits to be had, and there are great challenges ahead of us, particularly the first 3,000 mile crossing across the Atlantic Ocean. But we decided we would do it. We decided we would give it our absolute best shot at getting across this ocean. I think we knew that if we got across that ocean, we could then take ourselves and we would make it back to Australia. But I also knew that life can change in 1 second. The day we left the Canary Islands to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, I knew I had 1,600,000 seconds where life could change. I knew our lives were at great risk. But the faith that my wife put in me to take her and those kids across that ocean meant my sense of worth was coming back. In October 2010, we sailed into our home port of Coffs Harbour. We'd sailed 16,000 nautical miles, or nearly 30,000 kilometres. Once we had crossed that Atlantic Ocean, our confidence and skills had grown to levels we had never experienced before. When we first bought the boat, people said to Deb, would you ever think about bringing the boat back to Australia? She said, oh, possibly Al might, but I think I'll just fly somewhere with the kids and we'll meet up with Al. But to see Deb and those children go from completely novice sailors into people who had sailed across the oceans of the world was the greatest experience I've ever had in my life. I had seen them literally transform before my eyes. I'd seen them going from frightened little kids who were too scared to sail from the English mainland 7 miles to the Isle of Wight. I used to see my 15-year-old daughter, Nikki, on the helm in the middle of the night, sailing this boat down these gigantic Atlantic swells. It was just one of the greatest things I could ever experience. And for me, to get my sense of worth back, to be the husband that I had always wanted to be again, and the father that I had wanted to be to my children, was a very, very empowering time. I don't think any of us ever realise how good an opportunity can turn us into a life-changing experience. And I look back to what I've done since then, and since I used my lived experience to help others. But there's also been some sad times. But from those sad times, I also learned positive messages. And in September last year, I spent the last 4 days and nights with my dad as he slowly died. He'd been diagnosed with cancer just 3 weeks before. And Dad and I had spent that time talking about our lives together, his childhood, my childhood, and what he meant to me as my dad. And I remember sitting there the morning that suddenly his demeanour changed, and I knew that his time was running out desperately quickly. And I held his hand, and I felt his pulse, and I watched him breathe, and slowly but surely his breaths just slowed. his pulse weakened, and suddenly he took his last breath, and his pulse stopped. And for all the things I've seen in my police career, for all the experience I've had, it made me realise very, very clearly that life and death is all about a second or a breath. So today I ask you to think about your life and what you're going to do from this point forward. And I ask you very sincerely, do not waste one breath, and do not ever waste 1 second in doing the things that you really want to do. Don't ever say, I would love to do that, but. Ask yourself, but what? Just go and do the things that you want to do to give you contentment and a sense of worth. Thank you very, very much.
If you go to this supermarket and shouting, I want to buy peace of mind, then people laughing or people feel that person's mind is something wrong.
Now, this word connections is a really interesting one because our kids today are more connected than ever.
Of course, then when you're in an institution, people call you up. They tell you to perk up. Yeah, perk up, because I didn't think of that.
I should have a happiness project, I decided. As soon as I have some free time, I'm going to do that.